Welcome, one and all, to episode number 2 of the Future So Right podcast. I am your host, Pete Beal, and we are back for another discussion about writing, publishing, the creative process, and everything in between. We have quite an exciting show lined up today, including a very exciting topic that I hope you will all enjoy. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who tuned in for episode number 1 of the Future So Right podcast 1 week ago. Your support is very much appreciated. With that being said, let's dive right into our main topic today, one which the NSA people listening to this microphone will probably grow suspicious over when I say this. Today, we are going to talk about killing people. Enjoy! As I'm sure you suspect by now, I'm not referring to killing actual people, but rather killing the characters in the stories that we write. It seems almost counterproductive to spend all of this time building these characters, developing these characters, giving them a personality of their own, a voice of their own, building friendships and relationships for them. We go to all of this trouble, and then at the end of all, we decide they have to die. And this came to my mind as I was working on the second draft of the current book I'm working on. I came to a chapter where a very significant character dies. And not a bad guy, not an antagonist, one of the good guys. Ultimately had to pay the price. And I was thinking about it, and it's been a little while since I wrote this story, initially back in November. And it's been even longer than that since I decided this character was going to die. And I was trying to think about everything that went into the process of deciding when it was going to happen and how it was going to happen and ultimately why it was going to happen. Why did this character have to go? So I was thinking about it because overall, I would say I don't enjoy necessarily killing characters. I feel like I've put all of this work into it. I should try to find a way for them to get out alive, but ultimately, sometimes it has to happen. Now, a lot of people don't like it when the good guys die, right? When they're reading a book and one of the favorite protagonists is the one that ends up biting it, they get mad. And some authors are notorious for killing characters that people love. George R.R. Martin comes to mind. And I was thinking, what is it that makes an author decide that it's this character's time to go? And I think it's a little different for each of us. But for me, one thing that really sticks out to me is that I never want to kill somebody just for the sake of killing them. I don't want to kill somebody for shock value, just so that somebody pulls back from the book like, oh my god, I can't believe he did that. That to me is cheap. It's a cheap way to get a reaction out of somebody. I believe if you're going to kill one of your characters that you've put all of this time into, there needs to be a reason that moves the plot of the story forward. Maybe sometimes that reason has to do with another character and how they're going to react to the death of this character. Maybe the death of this character is going to trigger a series of events that is going to determine where the story goes from here. I'm going to go over a few examples a little later on from some well-known stories that I think will help explain a little bit of what I'm talking about here. So I was wondering to myself, what was it that made me decide to kill this particular character towards the end of a third book in a trilogy? I could have had him survive without altering the outcome of the story. So why did he have to go? Well, there are characters who are going to go on to additional books beyond this series. And when I was looking at those books, I didn't see a place for this character. And I like this character. I enjoy writing it, but there was no place there for them. Now, that still doesn't necessarily mean that I had to kill them. I could have let them survive, and then when I get to those books, could have written off, oh, that character went and lived happily ever after, or just not mention them at all. But to me, they had more value by dying. And the reason I say that is because by dying, they're going to trigger an emotional response and a psychological response in the characters that do move forward into future books. And that's going to shape who those characters become. And I need those characters to become very specific people in order to play the part that they need to play in the future. So this is something that's going to impact... Honestly, I'm probably not going to write these stories for a few years. But it had to be done. It had to draw that response from the other characters in the story. And I felt badly about it. But ultimately, you have to be a little ruthless. And once you decide something, this is what has to happen. This character has to go. You have to kind of stick to your guns, don't you? Because if you waffle too much on these, if you decide, I'm going to kill this character, and then when the time comes you decide not to kill this character, you're going to fall into a habit of doing that, I think. And ultimately, if you're not willing to pull the trigger, so to speak, on your characters, your stories aren't going to have as much emotional weight. The reader needs to know that there are potential consequences to the things that are happening in your stories. If they think that everybody is going to get to the end and everybody's going to live happily ever after every time they open one of your books, you're not going to be able to build tension in that story. You're not going to be able to build concern for the reader. They're not going to be worried about, oh, is this character going to make it? Are they going to get out of this tight spot? They're already going to know that the character is going to get out of that tight spot. You need to leave them wondering. You need to keep them in suspense. Now, as important as it is to be able to actually kill your characters and be able to pull the trigger on those moves, I think it's equally important to recognize when maybe you're making a mistake by killing a character. And I know that's going to sound a little hypocritical after the spiel I just went on about you've got to be able to pull the trigger, but there are some times where it's not the appropriate action. And you go into it thinking it is, and as you're writing the sequence maybe, or maybe afterwards, or in the build-up to it, you realize that you're making a mistake. That there's still room for this character, that this character still has a purpose that would be better served alive than dead. And I think that we shouldn't be too afraid of changing our minds in those instances. But what you need to make sure you're doing is not talking yourself out of killing a character just for the sake of letting them live. That character needs to serve a purpose going forward. You initially decided to kill them for a reason, right? So, what is the reason that's so compelling for them to live that it's going to override your previous logic? And in the previous book of this set, that actually happens to me. I had initially planned to kill a different character. And this, ultimately, as I was going through my first draft and I was getting close to the point of writing this character's death, it just occurred to me that this didn't feel right. And I felt like there was more for this character to achieve and more for them to provide to the story by allowing them to live. Now, that doesn't mean that this character got off light. They actually have a horrible ordeal that they have to go through. And that's going to shape who they are going forward. And who they are as a result of those experiences is going to bring a lot to the table down the line. Whereas the character that I actually did go through with killing, they're a character I enjoyed writing, but at the same time, I had to recognize their development had sort of peaked. That character had reached the end of the road, so to speak. There was no more I could do for them to make them more interesting than they were, to make them contribute more to the story than they were. There was no place for them going forward. But there was a place for the character that I had previously planned on killing. So there's room to spare some of them if you can give yourself a justifiable reason for doing so. If you ever come to this point, my best advice would be think to yourself, why was this character going to die in the first place? Maybe even write down the reasons. Write down pros and cons lists of a character living or dying. You need to understand that when you kill a character, unless you're one of those authors that brings people back from the dead, which for the most part I'm not a fan of, you need to understand they're gone. And once you've made that decision and you've put that book out there, that is it. And if you try to go back on it later, that's going to be very, very obvious to anyone reading the story that you realized after the fact, oh shoot, I had made a mistake. So it's not a decision you should make lightly. But if you feel you have the right reasons, then yes, you should be bold, you should be fearless about going through with it. I think the best policy, anytime you're killing a major character, especially a protagonist. So antagonists, sometimes we just know they have to die regardless, even if we enjoy writing them, even if they're a character with depth and layers to them. If they're a bad guy and there's just no other way around it, we just often know from the beginning that they're going to have to go, right? And so that makes those decisions easier. But when we kill a character that the reader is rooting for, I think sometimes the best thing we can do is what I mentioned earlier. Okay, this is a major character. I need to make sure that I know what I'm doing here, that I'm making the right decision. I'm going to make out a list. These are the reasons this character should live. These are the reasons this character should die. And you should compare them to each other. And a lot of times that hesitancy, you'll find when you're listing in the pros, oh, this character is fun to write. Well, I appreciate that, but that's not a reason not to kill them. Oh, this character provides comic relief, and I don't want to get rid of that. Well, are you writing a novel that's meant to be a comedy? Because otherwise, I don't think that's really a legitimate excuse either. You can provide comic relief from anywhere. You don't need one specific character to make that happen. You know, most of the time, those instances are just going to be our own reluctance because we've grown comfortable with a character. And we realize that when we let that character go, that familiar presence isn't going to be in the story anymore. And that can be a daunting task. How do you fill the void left by them? I think part of that is going to go back to our topic of last week. By all means, if you haven't listened to the episode, please go back and do so on outlining. If you've outlined your story, you're going to know exactly what the ramifications of each character's death is going to be, and you're going to know how you're going to move forward without them. So that's going to take a little bit of that fear of letting go of a major part of your story. So I mentioned at the beginning that we were going to discuss some examples in popular literature of character deaths and examine why the author might have deemed they would be necessary. Now, I didn't want to turn this into a spoiler fest that a lot of you would not want to listen to, obviously. So I decided to go with a series where I believe everyone who wants to read these books probably already has, or they've seen the movies, and I'm talking about the Harry Potter series. So let's take a look at a few of the deaths in Harry Potter and examine why they may have been necessary to further the story. Spoiler warning, if you have not read the Harry Potter books, now would be a good time to take a pause and come back after you have. Okay? I'll take a long pause here, give you a chance to turn back. Okay, I think that should be an adequate opportunity for everybody who doesn't want spoilers to have clicked off of this podcast. So in preparation for this, I turned to the good old internet, and I wanted to know which deaths in the Harry Potter series made people the most angry. Because let's face it, people have emotional responses to deaths of their favorite characters, which I suppose if you're doing your job as an author, they should. You should want people to be mad at you or upset about the death of one of their favorite characters. So I picked out a few that I saw come up the most often, and we're going to discuss them and talk about what I believe was likely J.K. Rowling's logic for killing these characters, from my point of view. Or at least why I would have killed these characters. I didn't see a single one that in the end I disagreed with. I thought, oh, they probably shouldn't have killed that character. So, let's get to work. First one is probably the easiest one, Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster of Hogwarts died in book number 6 at the hands of Snape. It was one of those big, shocking moments of the series. Snape walks out and just apparently murders Dumbledore in cold blood. Dumbledore obviously had to die before Book 7 came along. This was really sort of a sure thing, even from the beginning of the series, that at some point, Dumbledore wasn't going to be there anymore. He had to go, and he had to go for the same reason that Obi-Wan Kenobi had to go in Star Wars. Ultimately, it's not Dumbledore's story. It's Harry Potter's story. And when Dumbledore is present in that story, Harry's journey becomes a lot less challenging, doesn't it? I mean, how exciting would Book 7 have been if we're like, okay, Chapter 10, Dumbledore finds a Horcrux and destroys it. Chapter 16, Dumbledore finds a Horcrux and destroys it. Dumbledore had to die so that Harry could be the one to fulfill this story, and he could be the one to go through the challenges that he ultimately had to face in defeating Voldemort. Now, do I believe Dumbledore could have been more helpful to Harry, like saying, hey, this is how you destroy a Horcrux? He obviously could have, but, that's just one of those creative liberties that authors sometimes have to take, right? He can't just sit there and spell out the whole thing for the kid. You gotta make him earn it. But obviously, Dumbledore was never going to be a part of the very end of the story, just because his presence changes everything. The Death Eaters never would have taken control of Hogwarts if Dumbledore was alive. Voldemort never would have taken control of the Wizarding World if Dumbledore was alive. Harry wouldn't have had to go on the run while looking for Horcruxes if Dumbledore was alive. It just keeps going on and on. If you wanted to have a particularly challenging final chapter for Harry and friends, Dumbledore's death was inevitable. And I think even though most fans were probably in a certain amount of denial about this, I think deep down, all of them had to know that at some point, Dumbledore was going to die. Rest in peace, Dumbledore. Another character whose death I saw listed quite a bit in the lists of deaths which really upset the fans was Severus Snape. Now, I think these particular complaints are quite frankly instances of fans being in denial about what needed to happen. And I've seen quite a few arguments which said Snape never needed to die because as soon as Harry came back to Hogwarts at the end of the 7th book, Snape should have found him and taken him aside and shown him the memories that Harry ended up seeing and explained everything. But to me, these arguments aren't based in logic, because these people need to realize the last time Harry saw Snape, he watched him murdering Dumbledore right in front of him. Harry was never going to trust anything that Snape had to say, anything that Snape had to show him. The only way for Snape to make Harry believe him was for Snape to die at the hands of Voldemort right in front of Harry. It was the only way that Harry was going to believe what Snape had to tell him. The only way that Harry was going to trust that he had to walk off and willingly give up his own life to save everybody else, all of his friends. It would not have been believable for Snape to just walk up to Harry in the hallway and take him into an empty classroom and say, "Oh, Dumbledore wanted me to kill him and you need to go die now." It's frankly, if that had been written in a book, I probably would have thrown the book across the room. If that had been how the story actually went down. I understand Snape's a character that a lot of people like, but inevitably, Snape had to die to complete his character arc. It just needed to happen so that Harry would end up doing what he had to do, and so that Snape could ultimately find redemption for the things that he had done in his life. So this brings us to one example that I see listed a lot on various Harry Potter fan sites as an unnecessary death. And it's one where I see the logic because of the way it happened and how sudden it was. But when I really dive into it, I think that I see the reasoning for this death occurring. And I'm talking about Fred Weasley in book number 7. Now, Fred Weasley dies very suddenly. There's no big dramatic scene. There's an explosion in the Battle of Hogwarts and boom, Fred is dead now. And I know a lot of people have an issue with that. But I think what you need to keep in mind about this is that scenes like this and character deaths like this are a good reminder to the reader of what the reality of this type of situation would be, right? People need to feel a certain way when they're reading about a war like is going on in the Battle of Hogwarts, and there needs to be a certain amount of realism to that. And the fact is that in this type of situation, there's going to be sudden deaths like that don't make sense, that come out of nowhere. And so Fred's death really added that. Now, why did it need to be Fred? Because they killed other people in the Battle of Hogwarts too. Well, Fred was in a unique spot to convey a certain message to the reader. For starters, you have the fact that he's a member of the Weasley family, Ron's brother, and there were 9 Weasley characters in this set of books. I had to count them on my fingers, but there were 9. And they were always on the forefront of this good versus evil struggle. So, if you think about it, would it have been realistic for all 9 of them to survive? I don't think so. So, how do you land on Fred as the decision? Well, once J.K. Rowling decided that it wasn't going to be Ron for sure, and it wasn't going to be Ginny for sure, her options were really limited. She could have killed, for example, Percy Weasley, but he was not a particularly well-liked character and wouldn't have elicited the same emotional response in the readers. The two older brothers, Bill and Charlie, just weren't well known enough to elicit such a response from the readers. So that left the two parents, and it left Fred and George. And ultimately, Fred and George were where she decided to direct the Weasleys' pain from being a part of this war, in that George ends up getting his ear blown off in the last book, and Fred ends up dying in the final battle. And the reason I think she went with this particular direction is because they were essentially comic relief, right, throughout the entire series. And this allowed them to make a noble sacrifice and to show that, just because a character's there for laughs and giggles doesn't ultimately mean that a reader can't get attached to them, that a reader can't be upset if something bad happens to them. And Fred and George were sort of uniquely placed within the series to be the victims in Book 7 on behalf of the Weasley family. So ultimately, did it have to be Fred specifically? No, I don't know that it did. But he was a very uniquely placed character where very few other characters would have carried the exact same weight by dying that sort of death and would have elicited a similar reaction from the audience. So that's why I ultimately think Fred Weasley was the choice there. So I was going to wrap it up there, but I just want to throw in one more, which is Hedwig. Hedwig is probably one that is the closest to a death that didn't need to happen in terms of moving the plot, but Hedwig is a good example of a symbolic death. By Hedwig dying, it's sort of severed that last remaining link that Harry had to the innocence of his childhood, and it sort of beckoned in a grim new era of his life. So Hedwig, plot-wise, didn't have to die, but sometimes deaths don't necessarily need to move the plot if they carry a certain symbolism with them. Now, I wouldn't recommend this with major characters. I think Hedwig was sort of the perfect choice to do this, along with perhaps Dobby. But, like say if J.K. Rowling had done that with by killing Ron Weasley or Hermione Granger, I think there would have been some outraged fans. Oh, I just decided to kill them to symbolize the end of Harry's childhood. So Hedwig was sort of the perfect choice to do that without, at the same time, altering the plot of the novel drastically. I think that was the reasoning for that one. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and hopefully you're able to take a little something away from it that might be helpful to you in your future writing endeavors. And if not, maybe you just enjoyed the discussion about killing people, as we said at the beginning, right? So, with that, we're going to wrap up this edition of the Future So Right podcast. I want to remind you that if you have topic suggestions, you can submit those on my website, petebeal.com, which will be linked down below if you're watching this via YouTube, or you might already be watching on the website. I also keep a library there of all episodes of this podcast for you to check out at your convenience. And if you're interested in being a guest of this podcast, there's also a form you can fill out, and I will get back to you as soon as possible, and we can get a time set up to have a discussion about writing. So with that, I think we're going to call this an episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. It means a lot, and I hope that you will return for the next episode, which will probably be coming within the next week or two. Thank you, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and keep writing.